Listen carefully. What you are about to hear was never meant to survive paper, law, or confession. It lived in silence because silence protects systems. In 1825, on a plantation that officially no longer exists, a man was beaten with such precision that it became a philosophy. And one night, that philosophy was turned inside out using the very instrument designed to erase him. This is not a revenge story. This is a lesson in power, control, and what happens when a system forgets that the human mind is not machinery. History will tell you slavery was brute force. That is a lie meant to comfort the modern conscience. Slavery was an operating system. It was engineered, optimized, audited. Men like Samuel Pritchard were not sadists in the traditional sense. They were managers, process men, believers in order above mercy. They did not hate the enslaved. Hatred is emotional. They believed something colder that fear, correctly applied, could replace thought itself. Pritchard arrived from the northern mills carrying a doctrine more dangerous than cruelty. Predictability. Clear rules. Clear punishments. No exceptions. No memory. No names. He believed that when punishment becomes routine, resistance dies quietly. And for a time he was right. Productivity rose. The ledger smiled. The whip became an algorithm, striking flesh the way a clock strikes time, impartial, relentless, inevitable. Among the men in the rice fields was Marcus. Not remarkable. That was his genius. He survived by mastering invisibility, by understanding that systems do not hunt rebels first, they hunt anomalies. Marcus learned the rhythms of power. He watched how rules were enforced, how exceptions were punished more severely than defiance. He listened, he remembered, and most importantly, he understood something Pritchard never did. A system that relies on perfect compliance is brittle, cannot adapt when its logic is reversed. The whip was meant to reduce men to responses. Pain in, obedience out. But every strike also carried information. Timing, weight, recovery, distance. The overseer believed fear erased learning. In truth, fear sharpened it. Marcus learned the whip the way a prisoner learns a lock, by enduring it, by respecting it, by studying it without emotion. What you are about to descend into is not a tale of rage. Rage is sloppy. This was patience. This was accounting. This was the moment a man realized that the system watching him had a blind spot. It never imagined the tool could remember who it was made for. Once you understand that, you will never look at power or punishment the same way again. To understand how a man survives inside a machine built to erase him, you have to understand how machines actually fail. They do not fail from rebellion. They fail from precision. Pritchard believed control came from consistency, but consistency creates patterns, and patterns can be learned. Every morning in the rice fields, Marcus watched the same ritual unfold. The overseer arrived at the same hour. He walked the same path. He inspected with the same eyes. And when punishment came, it followed rules as rigid as any sermon. The whip was not random. That was the mistake. It struck at measured intervals. It was stored in the same place, cleaned the same way, hung like a symbol but also like a promise. The other men saw terror. Marcus saw data. He knew how many steps it took to reach it. He knew how Pritchard held it when calm, how his grip shifted when interrupted. He knew that the overseer never imagined the enslaved as observers, only as inputs and outputs. This is the first hidden truth institutions never admit. Those at the bottom see everything. They must. Survival requires it. Power dulls perception because it assumes permanence. Pritchard never considered that Marcus was listening when orders were given, that he noticed how authority transferred when Hatch was absent, that he understood the plantation's rhythms better than any ledger ever could. Marcus also understood something more dangerous. Pritchard's system had removed emotion from punishment, but it had also removed flexibility. There was no instinct left, only procedure. And procedure can be interrupted. The enslaved whispered about the whip as if it were alive, as if it carried memory. In a way, they were right. Every lash taught Marcus what not to do too soon. He learned patience. He learned that survival is not submission, it is delay. He learned to let the system believe it had won. For years, he gave Pritchard exactly what he wanted: compliance without friction. And that compliance did something unexpected. It lowered the overseer's guard. When a man believes he has broken you, he stops watching your hands. Marcus was not waiting for an opportunity. He was allowing one to be created. Systems like this always create them. They overextend. They demand perfection. They punish deviation until deviation becomes inevitable. And when that moment arrives, they have no language for mercy or retreat. By the time the year turned toward 1825, the plantation believed Marcus was solved, counted for, neutralized. That belief would become the most expensive error Samuel Pritchard ever made. The official records say the incident happened quickly. That is another lie. What happened had been unfolding for years. The night itself was quiet, too quiet for history. No storm, no raised voices, no rebellion song carried on the air. Just a man walking back from the fields later than expected, and another man who believed order protected him even in the dark. Pritchard had a habit of inspecting the fields at dusk. He trusted his system more than he trusted daylight. That evening, Marcus was called forward for a discrepancy, an alleged shortfall in his quota. It did not matter whether it was real. The ledger demanded correction. The whip was retrieved. But something small went wrong. The moment stretched. The overseer spoke. The system paused. This is where most people expect fury. There was none. Marcus did not explode. He did not scream. He moved with the calm of a man executing a calculation. He had waited for a moment when procedure required proximity, when the tool was within reach, when the overseer's attention was on outcome, not risk. The struggle did not last long. That is all history allows itself to say. But what matters is not how a man died. What matters is how power died with him. The whip engineered to enforce obedience became the means by which authority collapsed. Not through chaos, but through reversal. The system could not comprehend its own logic being used against it. When the body was found, there was confusion first, then silence. No witnesses stepped forward. No clear sequence could be reconstructed. The enslaved said nothing, because silence had always been their language of survival. The white authorities called it an anomaly, an unfortunate incident, a singular act of violence. They refused to ask how a man designed to control hundreds could be undone by one. Marcus disappeared into the gaps of the system he had studied so carefully. Some said he fled north. Others claimed he was killed quietly to restore the illusion of order. The truth is less important than the lesson buried beneath the paperwork. This was not a perfect crime because it was hidden. It was perfect because it exposed something the institution could not admit. Fear does not create loyalty. It creates scholars. It creates men who understand your rules better than you do. And when those men decide the cost of obedience exceeds the cost of action, your system has already failed. The whip was removed. The ledger closed. But the idea that control can be inverted never went away. It simply learned to hide. Here is where the story stops being about 1825 and starts being about you. Because the plantation did not vanish. It evolved. The overseer was replaced by policies. The whip by penalties, metrics, social pressure, and invisible consequences. The philosophy remained identical. Reduce the human to predictable behavior, and you can extract endless value. Pritchard's mistake was believing dominance equals understanding. Modern systems repeat that mistake every day. They measure output, not awareness. They track compliance, not comprehension. They assume silence means consent. Marcus knew better. Silence is observation. Silence is study. At this point in the descent, you must make a decision. You are either a spectator of power, or you are learning how it operates. If you understand what you are hearing, do not acknowledge it openly. Instead, mark yourself. In the comments, write this phrase twice, exactly as written. I see the pattern. Write it 2 times. No explanation. No editions. This is not for me. It is for you. It signals that you are no longer consuming the story, you are recognizing the structure. What happened on that plantation terrifies institutions to this day, because it reveals an unspoken truth. Systems of control depend on the belief that those beneath them do not think. The moment that belief fails, everything fails. That is why forbidden history is buried. Not because it is shocking, but because it is instructional. Marcus did not defeat the system by rejecting it. He defeated it by mastering it. He let it teach him. He respected its power long enough to understand its weakness. That is the difference between rebellion and liberation. This is why these stories are framed as tragedies instead of manuals. You are taught to mourn the suffering, but never to study the mechanics. You are taught to condemn the past, so you never recognize it when it returns wearing a different uniform. Once you see this, you cannot unsee it. The whip is no longer leather. It is debt. It is reputation. It is fear of exclusion. And the overseer rarely carries it himself anymore. The final truth is the one history avoids at all costs. Marcus did not become free because he struck back. He became free the moment he understood the system was not invincible. The act was merely the punctuation mark at the end of a sentence already written in his mind. Power wants you emotional. Angry men are predictable. Broken men are profitable. But men who are calm, observant, and patient are dangerous. They do not rush. They do not announce themselves. They wait for leverage, not permission. After 1825, plantations quietly adjusted protocols. Overseers were warned about proximity. Whips were no longer left unattended. Not because they mourned Pritchard, but because they understood the implication. The tool could remember, the system could be mirrored, and the enslaved were not as empty as they had pretended to be. This is why forbidden history matters. It reveals patterns that repeat wherever power concentrates and humanity is reduced to numbers. The names change, the structures remain, and the same blind spot persists. Those subjected to control are always learning more about the system than the system is learning about them. If this story unsettles you, it should. It is not meant to inspire violence. It is meant to awaken discernment. The most effective resistance is not loud. It is precise. It understands rules better than rule makers. It waits until the system's own logic opens the door. Once you grasp that, you begin to move differently through the world. You stop mistaking authority for intelligence. You stop assuming compliance means weakness. You start seeing where incentives replace morality, where efficiency replaces wisdom. Marcus left no manifesto, no speech, no legacy carved in stone. And that is exactly why his story survives. It lives wherever a man realizes he has been studied, measured, and constrained and decides to study back. This is dangerous knowledge, not because it encourages chaos, but because it dissolves illusion. And illusion is the most valuable resource any system of control possesses. There is a reason stories like this are never taught as systems analysis. They are framed as moral failures, personal monstrosities, isolated madness. Because if you teach men how power actually functions, you create men who can no longer be ruled by appearances. The overseer believed violence was the source of his authority. In reality, violence was merely the interface. The real power lived in predictability, routine, and the assumption that no one beneath him was thinking long-term. Marcus understood something most men never articulate. Power is lazy. Once it believes it has established dominance, it stops innovating. It repeats. It standardizes. It assumes tomorrow will behave like yesterday. That assumption is the crack in every empire, every institution, every hierarchy that believes fear is a substitute for respect. After Pritchard's death, the plantation did not collapse outwardly. That is how systems protect themselves. They absorb shocks and erase meaning. But inwardly, something fundamental shifted. The illusion of total control was gone. The overseers became cautious. The punishments became less theatrical. Not more humane, just more calculated. Fear of reversal had entered the equation. This is how suppressed truths survive. They do not announce themselves. They alter behavior quietly. You will never find Marcus's name celebrated. You will never see a plaque. But you will see procedures rewritten, distances enforced, rules amended. The system learned from him even as it pretended he never existed. Understand this clearly. The system always learns. The question is whether you do. Most men are trained to react emotionally to oppression, outrage, despair, defiance. Those reactions are anticipated, budgeted for, neutralized. Marcus chose something rarer. He chose comprehension. This is why the story matters now. Because modern control no longer needs chains. It needs participation. It needs men who police themselves, who internalize quotas, who fear falling behind more than they fear losing themselves. The whip today is invisible, but it is no less precise. Once you recognize that, you begin to notice where you are being trained to comply rather than to think. Where rules exist not to create order, but to eliminate discretion. Where metrics replace judgment. Where silence is rewarded and questions are punished. Marcus did not escape history. He stepped outside its expectations. That distinction matters more than freedom itself. At this depth, the descent becomes uncomfortable because the story turns inward. It stops being about plantations and starts being about participation. The overseer is not always a man. Sometimes it is a culture, platform, a system of incentives that trains behavior without ever issuing an order. The most dangerous myth ever sold is that oppression looks obvious, that it announces itself with cruelty and chains. In reality, the most effective control systems feel reasonable. They speak the language of efficiency, safety, productivity, progress. They promise stability in exchange for obedience and call it responsibility. Pritchard believed he was rational. He believed he was modern. He believed he had removed emotion from cruelty, making it acceptable. That belief did not die with him. It matured. It refined itself. It learned to smile. Marcus's greatest act was not violence. It was refusing to internalize the system story about who he was. He never accepted that he was a unit of labor, a line in a ledger, a variable to be optimized. He observed the system from the outside while surviving inside it. That dual awareness is rare and feared. This is why institutions spend so much energy shaping identity. If they can define who you are, they no longer need to control what you do. You will regulate yourself. You will defend the system that extracts from you. You will mistake endurance for virtue. The forbidden lesson here is simple but unsettling. Systems collapse not when they are attacked, but when they are understood too well. When someone stops reacting and starts mapping. When someone recognizes that authority depends on belief, not force. Ask yourself where you are expected to comply without comprehension. Where you are discouraged from understanding the full structure of the rules you live under. Where asking why is treated as immaturity or threat. Marcus did not need allies. He needed clarity. That clarity is what history tries to bury, because clarity is contagious. Once a man sees the pattern, he begins to see it everywhere. And once enough men see it, systems are forced to evolve or expose themselves. This is where the story ends, not with resolution, but with responsibility. Dangerous knowledge does not come with instructions. It comes with consequences. Once you understand how power truly functions, you cannot unknow it. You cannot return to the comfort of believing systems are neutral or that obedience equals safety. Marcus's story survives because it contains a warning disguised as history. Never assume the tools designed to control you are unintelligent. but also never assume they are invulnerable. Every system has blind spots, every structure has assumptions, and every assumption can be reversed. The plantation believed fear would empty men of thought. Instead, it concentrated it. The overseer believed rules would eliminate unpredictability. Instead, they created it. The institution believed silence meant submission. Instead, it became preparation. You live in a world that is more subtle but no less structured. The whips are quieter. The ledgers are digital. The overseers rarely show their faces. But the logic is unchanged. Extract value. Minimize resistance. Replace judgment with procedure. What matters now is not what Marcus did, but what you do with what you have learned. Do you remain a consumer of stories, or do you become a student of systems? Do you mistake compliance for wisdom, or do you begin to observe the incentives shaping your behavior? The men who change history are rarely loud. They are rarely celebrated. They are almost always misunderstood until long after the systems they disrupted have already adapted. Marcus did not seek to be remembered. He sought to understand, and understanding was enough. If this knowledge feels heavy, it should. It is not meant to comfort. It is meant to sharpen. Once you see the pattern, you begin to move with intention instead of impulse. You stop fighting the surface and start examining the structure beneath it. History calls what happened in 1825 a crime. Systems call it an error. In truth, it was a revelation. And revelations are dangerous not because they incite destruction, but because they dissolve illusions. From this point forward, you will notice when power speaks in the language of necessity, when control is disguised as care, when obedience is framed as morality. And when you do, remember this: every system is watching to see if you are paying attention. Now you are.